Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Twilight of the Dons. British intellectuals from World War II to Thatcherism is a fascinating book. It's a look at the rise to power and eventual fall from grace of the Oxbridge intellectual. I'm delighted to say that we're joined live by Colin Kidd, who is the author of Twilight of the Dons. Good morning to you, Colin.
Morning.
Are you sitting somewhere in a sort of dusty library somewhere, having just got back from a bit of punting this morning? Is that where we find you?
No, I'm here in St Andrews in Scotland, and although it's the middle of June, it's freezing. And I'm resisting putting on the central heating.
Fair enough. Well, just to let you know, the air conditioning failed in the studio this morning down in the southern Spain. So yes, it's been a trifle warm, but there you go. Just explain a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book.
So I was for a period for 7 years between 1987 and 94. I was a resident fellow of All Souls College in Oxford and got to know some of the figures who are mentioned in the book. And then All Souls is the most unusual college in that it has both, it has no students, but it has resident fellows and also non-resident fellows. And for 14 years between 2005 and 2019, I was one of these non-resident fellows. And in the course of that time, I gave a couple of lectures to the college about some aspects, episodes in its more recent history, and that was the kernel of the idea for the book. I was so fascinated by the episodes that I had come across that I thought it might broaden out into a kind of a book that was a collection of episodes.
Because if you think about it, I mean, the rarefied oxygen atmosphere of Oxbridge. I mean, David Attenborough should really have done a series, shouldn't he? It should be his next thing. He should go into the cloisters of the great universities and find out, because there are species found, as Sir Ken Robinson said, there are some species found there that don't actually can't really exist in the real world.
Yes, I suppose there is an element of that, and I suppose I was trying to capture some of the psychological and behavioural quirks of some of the fellows. I mean, one who particularly fascinated me was someone who, if he spotted one of his fellow academics in the street, and the academic wasn't wearing a tie, he would cross the road to avoid saying hello to the academic, because he thought if the academic wasn't wearing a tie, he didn't want to be recognised.
Well, exactly. Hence why I'm not wearing my tie today as well. It's an interesting period of time, though, isn't it, that we're looking at here? Because if you think of the Twilight of the Dons, up until the Second World War, this had been an untouchable institution. You could say almost in a way that they're shaken by the spirings and stuff, the revelations that will come out later on. But one might argue that Oxbridge has got an important part to play in the land fit for heroes after the Second World War. Although it's becoming a much more egalitarian society, you still need the best brains in the best places. But of course, then you've got the students, the fellows, looking into and asking what their place in the world is, isn't it? Really, I suppose, Colin.
Yes, well, I think the war was quite transformative, because prior to the war, especially among the students, there was quite a lot of hostility to the establishment. The 1930s, the 1930s was a decade when it looked as though possibly the future was going to be an alternative between communism and fascism, and so many moved to the left. But in the course of the war, those students who'd been disaffected with the establishment before the war found a niche, many of them, during the war, not only in warfare itself, but in various other enterprises, including educating the troops in broadcasting, in code breaking, particularly at Bletchley Park. And I think many of the academics became reintegrated with their own society in the course of the war. And so that even after the war, yes, we see a range of political viewpoints among the academics of Oxford and Cambridge, but by and large, these views coexisted with an acceptance of the establishment. And I think the war had a lot to do with that, because it was a war in which the principles at stake were pretty clear. It was easy, I think, to be a patriot in World War II. And
of course, we get into, after the war, there is there is the question of what sort of, I guess I said before, what sort of Britain are they building? And what role does, are the old structures, even perhaps more so than after the First World War, which has a profound effect, and it basically gets rid of the Edwardian stroke Victorian society before then, into the 20th century, get universal suffrage. However, the introduction of the NHS, the massive social process, the education, which you can't underlook, and the setting up of comprehensive schooling. These are all things that have an effect, and also make intellectuals look at their role and question, because if you are at Oxford or Cambridge in the 30s, it's black and white. You are either with Mitfords, or you are coming to my part of the world and fighting for the Republicans. So it seems very black and white, and perhaps they have that middle-age academic crisis about what I'm building, and am I part of the establishment? Should I go and work for the BBC, or should I do something else? And that perhaps can be seen as maybe the beginning, the first sort of sparks of the Twilight sort of fading out.
Well, I think it takes a little bit. It comes a little bit later than that. I think the period from the late 40s, certainly through the 1950s, is one of a fairly relaxed acceptance of things as they are, where the academics are pretty well integrated into the establishment. Things, I think, they start to go wrong, I think, in the early 60s, when there's a government report which is in favour of the extension of new universities. But at the same time, this Robbins report actually questions the special status enjoyed by Oxbridge. And I think we begin to see a partial unravelling in the 1960s, when the body that had been in charge of university finance was kept at arm's length from the government, but was actually part of it. Was under the sponsorship of the Treasury, which has always been sort of right at the very heart of what you might call the deep state in the UK. And actually, the universities sort of they suffer a certain sort of loss of access and influence when the University Grants Committee is transferred in the early 1960s to the Department of Education, and there's a slight loss of prestige there. Of course, what really changes things is the student protests of the late 1960s, with the advent of student radicalism, and that, I think, does dent the self-confidence of the academics.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting. So presumably this report, is that what gives rise to what are called the red brick universities then? Is that where the sudden beat?
Well, no, they go back to the late 19th century. Okay. I suppose in fact, we've got different categories of university. We've got Oxbridge, Oxford and Cambridge. We've got the red bricks, which are civic universities developed in the mid to late 19th and early 20th century. And then in the 1960s, we've got about 7 what are called plate glass universities, which are in smaller country towns. There's a slightly different atmosphere associated with them. These are places like the University of Sussex and the University of Warwick and
Brunel,
so forth in the
that's
1960s.
Well,
and of course, we've also got these other ones like the traditional Scottish universities that go back to the Middle Ages as well. So it's a very diverse system. But I think what differentiates it from Europe is that in Europe, the great universities tended to be in capital cities. But what makes England different is that Oxford and Cambridge develop outside the capital.
It's also the other thing that strikes me is the fact that, we talk about the universities, Oxford and Cambridge, losing touch with quote unquote the establishment, but they are still going into top jobs. I mean, if you look at the BBC, this may be seen facile, but the BBC, that was the way, all these great satire programs that come out that are seen as revolution at the time of these angry young men and women. These are all from Oxford and Cambridge. These are not, these are, Jonathan Miller, all the footlights people. I mean, they are criticising the establishment. Peter Cook famously having a club called The Establishment, but at the same time they are of the establishment, which and people are going into less high profile. They're still going into the trade. They're still going to the Foreign Office. They're still getting so. You can kind of understand when it gets more radical in 68, when it's the, Paris is in flames, we got the Prague Spring, etc., and we have the big anti-Vietnam demonstration at Grosvenor Square, 68, and that. Yep. But is it the sea change because, the students are trying to step away from that Oxbridge, even though they're part of Oxbridge, they don't want to be seen as part of Oxbridge. If you see what I'm saying, that makes any sense to you, Colin?
Yes. Yes, I mean that's certainly the case. We see quite a transformation in the relationship of the academics and the students in the 1960s, because I think previously, I think we tend to use the term paternal for the relationship, but actually it's almost fraternal in the sense that. Many academics were resident in colleges. They saw themselves as partners with their undergraduates in the learning process, and they rubbed along to get together in a somewhat carefree, convivial way. And I think it came as a great shock to the academics in the late 60s and early 1970s to think that they were now in some kind of adversarial relationship with their students. That was a real dent to their self-confidence. By the way, you mentioned the BBC as well. From the late 1940s through to the late 1960s, the academics have access to what's the predecessor of Radio 3 on the BBC, which was called the Third Programme. And it wasn't just a classical music station, but there were a lot of academics giving talks on subjects at the frontiers of knowledge.
I was about to say that, because you have Bertrand Russell coming out with the CND marches, Aldermaston. You've got these giants of philosophy coming on national TV in a world where we live with Strictly Come Dancing and Ice Bake Off or whatever it's called. It sort of boggles my tiny mind, the fact that you have these heavyweights having these huge debates on radio, on television, and so academic life is seen as part of normal life rather than some gilded, rarefied atmosphere, which perhaps it could be regarded as for things. For example, like when the social earthquake when Margaret Thatcher gets in power, but there've also been a change in there, because we mentioned 68 and that whole sort of everybody's got a picture of Che on the wall, and then it's the Marxist beliefs, and we're getting and there are some really groundbreaking shaking events happening. This is explain things, because I like an oxymoron like as best as anybody else, but this Tory Marxism. Now, I have studied my oxymorons, but this is I'm very interested in this one, because people always call me the Trotskyist. So, what's Tory Marxism then? Can I get involved?
So basically, this concerns the emergence of a new right in Cambridge, particularly associated with its oldest college, known as Peterhouse. And there was one particular Don there called Maurice Cowling, who was at the heart of the New Right. And Cowling taught Marx for many years, and basically he saw his position as one of effectively, he adopted a Marxist perspective. He believed in things like class conflict, but he saw class conflict from the perspective of the bosses rather than the workers. And the other thing is he was a great critic of liberalism, which he thought, with its emphasis on the rights of the individual, had too much of a kind of a thin, narrow understanding of how people lived in societies, lived in communities. And in that sense, Cowling and his proteges, although they were conservatives and as such generally against the left, nonetheless adopted various Marxist approaches and techniques and insights in their approach to the study of society. Essentially, I suppose what I'm saying is they were more critical of liberalism than they were of Marxism. And they were those most associated with the advent of Thatcherism. And this is an irony because, of course, Margaret Thatcher in some way was a classical 19th century liberal with the emphasis on laissez-faire, the free market, and so on. Whereas these conservatives were more, how shall I say, communitarian. They were focused statist as well. They weren't, as it were, followers of Adam Smith. They thought that Marx had as much to teach us as Adam Smith.
When we go through that, and also you raise interesting points as well about the relationship that we have, and this is something we're debating today, about the relationship we have across the pond with the States. And of course, 1963 is the assassination of Kennedy. And you make a point of this in the book. Explain to the listeners a little bit about how this is a key point.
Yes. So this is actually how the book started. This was actually the first piece of inquiry I did, and it was exploring how a series of Oxbridge figures, in particular the Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford, Hugh Trevor Roper, who later became the Master of Peterhouse in Cambridge in the early 60s. He was very sceptical of the process by which the Warren Commission report into the assassination of John F. Kennedy had been put together. And he analysed its research processes and the way it reached decisions. And he found something, he basically found it a little bit slapdash. And as such, he began a debate about how justified the Warren Commission was in reaching the conclusions that it did, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman. Now, where this is important in understanding the role of Oxbridge Dons is that, by and large, in the first year or so after the assassination of Kennedy, there was except in the very, very fringes of the extreme far left, and I don't mean even the mainstream far left, just the very extreme of it, there was some criticism of the Warren Commission. But by and large, there was almost universal acceptance, right and for much of the left, that the Warren Commission's conclusions were sound. And it's actually the involvement, when you mentioned Bertrand Russell as well, he was also involved in this. He set up a Who Killed Kennedy committee in Britain, in which Trevor Roper sat, and it created this debate. And Trevor Roper was answered in the UK by John Sparrow, who was the warden of All Souls College. And interestingly, this debate then sort of spread back across the Atlantic, and I think it gave some gravitas. It gave some prestige to those on the very extremes of American politics who were critical of the Warren Commission. So in a way, I think the lack of acceptance that you now find in America about the Warren Commission, about Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin assassinating Kennedy, that skepticism actually originates with figures like Bertrand Russell and Hugh Trevor Roper in Oxford and Cambridge.
And in a world where you don't have, in a golden time when you don't have social media, when anybody can put everything all the time out there, I mean, the assassination of Kennedy is the closest thing the Americans have to a regicide. I mean, it is,
yes.
and there is a universal shock and revulsion and disbelief. So for an establishment like that, again, I keep using the word earthquakes and shockwaves, but again, it is because the special relationship is very, very tight indeed. And these, LBJ's there. I know Wilson is now in government, but still, there is still that is seen as the estate. Both sides of Washington and Whitehall are very, very close indeed. So something like this coming out throws the proverbial academic spanner in the works.
Yes, and what I show at the time is that many Oxbridge academics had become accustomed to moving across to the States on visiting professorships and so on, certainly in the early 60s. And so Trevor Roper, when he starts his inquiries into the Warren Commission, he's actually based in Los Angeles. As a visiting professor at the Clark Institute and Library there, and that's when he begins his researches in this, and so are many of his colleagues. So there is a quite there's still, I think, at this stage in the United States, there's still an Anglophile establishment that tends to worship Oxford and Cambridge, and so. Some of the figures involved in the debate appear, for example, on American television, which I think these days for an Oxford or Cambridge Don to appear on American television
on Fox News, I can see it now. I can see it now.
Incident. Yeah. It would be somewhat unusual.
Yeah.
Again, I think there's also a number of Oxford and Cambridge Dons contributing to American magazines and newspapers and so on. So they enjoy very great prestige, but it's not only in the UK; it's in the Anglophone world as a whole, and I think that's something that has been lost certainly since the 1960s.
Is it too easy to put broad strokes on everything and say, well, when Margaret Thatcher gets into power in '79, and then the relationship with anything of the establishment is kind of wrecked? Because can you argue that because she comes from a fierce political operator, a brilliant brain, but a great believer in free markets and an Atlanticist. This was how the specialization comes. Yeah. But does she see the established universities, Oxbridge, as very intelligent but no common sense, i.e. there's nothing going to a business background, so therefore she can't quite get she can't get understanding of it because it doesn't register in how she sees the world.
Yes, that's very much the case, and of course she herself is an Oxford graduate. And one of the great controversies of her time in office came at the start of 1985 when Oxford declined. I mean, the Oxford Dons voted roughly 2-1 not to award her the honorary degree that was customary for Oxford graduates when they became Prime Minister. And although she pretended, I think, not to be upset by this, I think that hurt her very deeply and was also something that caused very grave divisions within the body of Oxford Dons, and in fact, I think some of the people involved are now dead, but it caused pain for many decades.
Yeah, and people don't. Again, people say, we talk about broad strokes, but people see Thatcher as this sort of 2D character, but she was a human being after all that. Yeah. What are you hoping that people are going to take from this fascinating book, and with a great title, by the way?
Well, I I suspect it will be received as part of a broader discussion, which is certainly happening these days, about the relationship of elite academic institutions to political establishments. We're certainly seeing this in the United States at the moment with Donald Trump's assault on the universities, and the New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who had the very famous televised interview with the three presidents of Harvard, Penn, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology that went viral, and eventually, through a month or so later, led to the resignation of Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard. Elise Stefanik has just published a book called Poisoned Ivies, which is an exploration of the disconnection of elite American universities from not only from the political establishment, but also from the general public as a whole. And so I suppose this book might, from a historical perspective, show that not all academic intelligentsias have been hostile to establishments, and that in the very peculiar case of the English academic elite, certainly between about the 1940s and the 1960s, was very well integrated with an establishment and very far from the typical cliche of the academic counterculture.
The book is called Twilight of the Dons, British Intellectuals from World War II to Thatcherism. It's by Colin Kidd, who is speaking today. Listeners, if you go into our virtual bookstore, you'll see the rather striking front cover, and you can click on that, and a well-known distribution firm modelled on an Amazonian river will be putting it your way. Colin, do you? I was going to say, do you do social media? I can't somehow. If you were to say,
I'm a bit of a fuddy-duddy in that respect.
Well, listen, congratulations on the book. It's been absolutely fascinating and fabulous. The book is called, listeners, go and order it. The book is called Twilight of the Dons. It's by Colin Kidd, who's speaking today. Colin, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Giles.